All right, good afternoon, Avian Science. I hope you appreciated this picture of a pigeon nest. It's amazing that they're so common when they build nests like that. I have a catio for my cats, and I had one try and build a nest on the bracing that was at the top of the catio. I'm like, really building a nest in a location where the cats can get to you. Okay. All right. So as usual, the quiz and the short answer questions are on Blackboard, and they're due on Sunday, January 30th before midnight. Nothing new to see there. So are there any things you want me to go over again from last time? Mary, you've got your hand up. I don't hear you, Mary.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just wondering when Tuesday's class and this class is going to be up for viewing.
Okay. They will both be up tomorrow for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. It takes about it takes a lot of time to get these posted on YouTube. So yeah, definitely tomorrow. All right, so we were talking about feathers last time. And we had just finished talking about the feathers on ratites, my favorite group of birds, you know, the ostriches, the cassowaries, the emus, and how those were probably what we would have seen on some of the early dinosaurs, some of the big dinosaurs, definitely the kind of feathers that T-Rex would have had. But now I want to talk about wing feathers. So the feathers in different parts of the wing have different names. So there are primary flight feathers, and secondary flight feathers. So if we look at this bird, the longest feathers right here are the primary feathers. The next row of feathers right here, closer to the body, but still sticking well out behind on the wing, those are the secondary feathers. Often these are just called primaries and secondaries. We also have overwing coverts, which are divided into primaries and secondaries again. If you're talking about the primary overwing coverts, you specifically mention that they're coverts, because if you say primaries, you're talking about these long feathers. Now, this has some animation, but it doesn't like to do the animation. There we go. It's frustrating. When I'm annotating, it doesn't like to do these navigations. So primaries are here, secondaries, primary coverts, secondary coverts. Don't worry about the term for this little bit right here. It's not very commonly used. And I have to erase that. So this is just another way to look at it. These are the primary flight feathers with the primary coverts. These are the secondary flight feathers with the secondary coverts. And again, there's some more terms on here that we're not worried about. We're not worried about marginal coverts, scapulas, or alula. We're just worried about these coverts and the primaries and secondaries. This is an underside of the wing. So the underwing coverts are just called underwing coverts. And again, you can see the primaries and the secondaries. And generally speaking, it's usually, there's a subtle difference between the secondaries and the primaries, but it's usually visible if you spread out a bird's wing. So again, you need to know primaries, secondaries, underwing coverts. Remember, we had overtail and undertail coverts. Coverts just means they cover. I mean, it says it right there in the name, cover and then TS. And it tells you where, the underwing or the overwing, or above the primary feathers, above the secondary feathers. Now, some birds have these specialized feathers called rictal bristles. You can see these long, kind of stiff feathers coming out around the beak. Rictal feathers are going to be around the beak. And they're found in birds that catch insects in flight. So if you see these on a bird, you know that bird eats insects and it eats them while it is flying. The structure is very different from a typical feather. I mean, you can tell by looking at it. It's long and narrow and stiff. It doesn't look like any other feathers. And it appears that the function of this is actually to protect the eye. If you think about it, you're a little bird and you're flying around and catching insects while you're flying. When you're coming up behind an insect, you've got your beak open, there's a chance that insect is going to dodge and try and avoid getting eaten, and you don't want it to end up in your eye. Eye damage can be deadly for birds. So that's what these structures are for. They're to stop insects from hitting the eyes. So let's talk about how feathers grow. You don't really have to worry about the terms in this picture, but I'm going to be pointing at a lot of things here. So feathers are made of a protein called keratin. You guys heard of keratin before? Yeah. It's because your hair is also made of keratin. Your fingernails are made of keratin. It's a very diverse protein that can do a lot of different things. Skin, horns, claws, hooves, fur, all of that is made of keratin. So it's protective and at least water resistant. And just like the hairs on your arms, feathers grow out from the skin. So there's going to be a bunch of cells here inside the skin that will start growing into a feather. And when the feather is growing, there's a good blood supply. This structure here in the middle, that's a blood vessel. So when feathers are actively growing, there is blood inside of them. And that's a very, very important thing to remember. These feathers, you can still see, you see this white, it looks almost like somebody slid a straw over the feathers. That's called a sheath. When you see a sheath, that tells you the feather is actively growing. And there is a blood supply in here. Now, this feather out here, that's just keratin. It's like your hair. There's no blood supply way out here past the sheaths. And if you cut these feathers, no big deal. Just like cutting your hair or your fingernails. But if you cut the feather here, where there is a blood supply, then there's a problem. If you cut into it where there is a blood supply, the shaft acts like a straw, which means the blood pushes out through that straw. Yes, it is painful. And yes, it's like cutting the quick on a dog's nail. However, there is one important difference between your dog toenail bleeding and a blood feather bleeding. Blood feathers can cause the bird to do what's called bleed out. Literally, it can kill the bird. Mary.
What can you do if you are a bird owner to stop the bleeding?
That is the next slide. I will get to that in just a second. Okay. In fact, I'll just get to that right now. So it is important. It is critical that you stop the bleeding. And you can use, make sure I've got my notes up here. You can use something like Quick Stop that you can get at pet stores or from your vets. When you have this situation, it is an emergency, and treat it as an emergency. So the first thing you do in an emergency is you take a deep breath, because if you're panicked, you're not going to be able to help the bird. Then you want to wrap the bird in a towel. If you've got a pet bird, towels are very important to have handy. And I didn't bring a towel in. But you want to wrap the bird to restrain it. Use Quick Stop. Put pressure on it, ideally with something like gauze, preferably sterile gauze. If it's a broken blood feather, Even if you stop the bleeding, the bird needs to see a vet. And that's because even though you put quick stop on here and you stop the bleeding, there's still this straw with blood in it. And quick stop will help clotting, but it's very, very easy for that to be damaged again and start to bleed again. And if you go to the vet, oh, I hate this. The vet will pull the blood feather. So this sounds kind of scary, but if you can get the feather completely out, there should be a little bulb here at the end. Then when you stop the bleeding, you don't have that straw effect. And that straw, the shaft really will pull blood out of the circulatory system. If you pull the bulb out, then the blood vessel can clot and heal normally. You can certainly learn to do this, but you really should have a vet show you how the first time, because you don't want to break the feather off closer to the skin and just continually make it more difficult to deal with. Yes, the feather will grow back. Now, what happens if you don't have quick stop? Maybe you don't have a pet bird, but a wild bird flies into your window and it happens to have a blood feather and the blood feather breaks. Cornstarch, flour, excellent. You guys know this. Cornstarch, flour, baking soda, those all are safe for birds. There are products at drugstores that they sell for shaving nicks. Those sometimes have chemicals in them that are not safe for birds. A lot of things that we use on people and on dogs and cats are dangerous or even deadly for birds. So you do not want to use that. No. Cornstarch, flour, baking soda, or quick stop that you bought at a pet store. All those are good. This is just an image to show you the difference between blood feathers and normal feathers. Normal feathers are mature feathers. There's no blood supply, no nerves. So this, you could damage this, you can cut this, it's not going to hurt the bird. This one will hurt the bird. You can consider this dead, just like the hair that you see is all dead. The fingernails, the part that you see is all dead. Blood is only present while they are growing. Now, feathers wear out, and they're critical for warmth, for flight, for camouflage. So healthy feathers are really, really important for birds. So periodically, birds do something called molting, where they are replacing all of their old feathers with new feathers. The old feathers fall out, new feathers grow in. It can occur little by little. So wild birds, most of them, when they are molting their flight feathers, they'll molt, like 2 off of each wing, wait for those to grow in, molt the next 2, wait for those to grow in, molt the next 2. So these are newer feathers on the outer part of the wing. These are older feathers, and these are new ones coming in. This budgie, you can see these little structures. These are new feathers just starting to grow in. In wild birds, molt often occurs just before migration. It can be either once a year or twice a year, depending on the species. Do all birds molt? Yes. Feathers are too important for them, and they need to be replaced in case, because of damage, because they're going to get damaged. And there's not any way for a bird to repair a damaged feather. Now, some birds do replace most of their feathers in a big go. So this chicken, look at this. Oh, this poor bird. All these new feathers coming in. Very few old feathers. This is common in chickens. So poultry have, an explosive molt. And waterfowl, they don't lose their body feathers like this, but they lose their flight feathers all at once. Even wild ducks will lose all their flight feathers at once. That means they cannot fly until the new ones are fully in. So ducks, geese, swans have between 20 and 40 days where they cannot fly, usually in the fall. The first time that happened to your chicken, yeah, I can see why you might think there's something seriously going wrong with this. It's normal. Mary, your hand's up again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't see anything that you're writing because me,
Oh, is
you,
it
and someone
behind
else
stuff?
is blocking it.
Okay. No, that's not going to work. All right. I'll write it here. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll be more careful about that. So poultry have explosive molt. Most feathers replaced all at once. Waterfowl, they don't lose their body feathers, but they do lose all of their flight feathers at once. which means they have a period of 20 to 40 days where they are unable to fly. And there's another molt in doves. They can have an explosive molt, worse than chickens, kind of. They can lose all of their tail feathers if they're attacked by a predator. So most predators are going to attack a bird from behind. And if the mourning dove hears them coming up and they start to take off, but the predator grabs the tail feathers, they can lose their entire tail. It makes it hard for them to fly because they've lost that ability to stabilize and steer, but they get away from the predator. So if you see mourning doves missing tails, they got a lucky escape. It's a normal process. Now, during molt, birds tend to get cranky. So if you've got pet birds and they molt, they often will be moody, either wanting more attention from you or not wanting attention from you. You know, we're mostly female here. It's kind of like a bird version of PMS. It's a temporary period where they're just moody. During this time, they need protein in their diet. If a bird doesn't have enough protein, they have difficulty growing those new feathers. So in the wild, birds will eat more insects to help provide that protein. And this is also why almost all bird species feed their offspring insects. So even if the adult bird is a seed eater, they will feed their babies, their chicks, insects, because seeds are lower in protein and growing birds need that protein. The big exception here are the pigeons and doves. And the reason for that is because pigeons and doves produce milk. Ooh, you thought only mammals produced milk, huh? Yeah, that is so not the case. In pigeons and doves, they produce a product called crop milk. And I know you don't know what the crop is yet. It's a structure in the throat of the bird. And there are glands in there that produce this liquid that can be used to feed their babies. Okay, back to the slideshow. So this is a turkey vulture flying, and they have what's called the sequential molt. This is for their flight feathers. So they'll molt one flight feather, then the next, sometimes two at a time. And you can see there's a new feather growing in here. There's this gap. And on the other wing, at about the same place, there's a new feather coming in. Why do these birds lose the same feather on each wing at the same time? Mary.
To keep them even, balanced?
Exactly. To keep them balanced in flight, because if they're flying and one wing has a gap in it, that's going to knock them, like you said, off balance, make it harder to fly. So this is a wood duck. Sorry, having trouble figuring out the which species this is. And you can see all of its flight feathers are coming in right now. Primaries here, secondaries here. This is a good example of the early stage of feather growth. These little pointy things are called pin feathers. And it's the earliest growth of new feathers. So all feathers coming in start out looking like this. In adult birds, you usually don't see this because the other feathers are covering it up. Some birds like it when you scratch their growing feathers to remove that sheath. Others don't. I mean, it's a personal thing. But only do this on contour feathers. Don't do it on flight feathers because you can cause a blood feather to burst and then you've got a bleeding bird. And isn't that the ugliest thing? Newborn baby birds are so ugly. So, Faith, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so you said blood feathers. What are blood feathers?
You just popped in, didn't you? So, blood feathers are feathers that are actively growing. And you'll want to go back and watch the video once I get it posted onto YouTube, because it's really important how you deal with blood feathers if they break. They can, I mean, a broken blood feather can kill a bird. So make sure you go back and watch that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I talked about birds molting, especially right before migration to replace worn out feathers. But birds also sometimes molt for appearances. During breeding season, this is a male bobolink. When it's not breeding season, this is also a male bobolink. They look very different whether or if in the breeding season compared to the non-breeding season. Breeding season is usually summer for most types of birds. So you're not gonna see this guy in January. Goldfinches. If you have goldfinches that come to your feeder in the summer, they're bright yellow, they've got black, they're very pretty. And you look at them in the winter, you might not realize that you're seeing the same species. They also look completely different in the winter. These are female bobolinks. This is non-breeding plumage. This is breeding plumage. There's not really much difference there. There's a little bit more color during breeding season, but generally speaking, for most birds, it's the male who has the attractive summer plumage. You guys probably can figure this one out. Why is it that the female looks kind of drab during breeding season? Faith, I see your hands up again. Go ahead.
Because females are the ones that have to find the best father for each one of their offspring, whereas the males get to breed in bulk.
Exactly.
And so the females will have to find, and so the females will be attracted to the males that appear to have the best genes.
Yeah, that's about half of it. This color is a way for this male to say, I have good genes. My children will have good genes. It's a way to attract the female. And if you think about it, especially something like a cardinal that's bright red, the males are bright red and the females aren't. The males are trying to visually attract females, but that also attracts predators. So they are more likely to be killed by a predator if they are brightly colored or have a lot of contrast like this guy. Makes it very easy for predators to see them. There's a second one. A second reason there, and I don't see that in the chat. But the females are often the ones who sit on the nest. And if she's sitting on the nest, you don't want bright colors that can attract predators. You want something that if she's sitting in a bush on a nest, it's going to be hard to spot her. That was good. Now, sometimes missing feathers are normal. We talked about vultures not having much in the way of feathers on the head to keep that tissue clean when they're, sticking their head in a carcass. These guys were bred for this appearance. I don't know who decided that that was something that they wanted a chicken to look like. Yeah, I'm right there with you, Tani. It's funny looking, absolutely. But sometimes missing feathers are not normal. So this little finch is missing feathers on its face. This cockatoo is missing feathers on the body. Notice how you're not seeing new feathers coming in on either of these. It's only on part of the body, and all of the feathers are gone. Yes, Rebecca, this is a stress behavior. So These conditions can be brought on by bad diet or by stress. Birds will feather pluck. It's kind of a behavior similar to cutting. The bird is stressed, bored, lonely. And so basically they're developing a mental illness. And the mental illness is so painful that pulling feathers out, having a physical pain, kind of helps relieve some of that mental pain. It's very depressing. It is also very common in certain species of birds in captivity. And our big guy here, the cockatoo, it is incredibly common in cockatoos in captivity. Once a bird starts doing this, it is nearly impossible to get them to stop. So birds that develop this habit, even if they get into a better situation that's better for them psychologically, they'll continue to feather pluck. And so their owners have to do things like a birdie version of an Elizabethan collar or put sweaters on them. We will talk more about this when we have our little discussion on parrots. This guy over here, I bet this is bad diet. Or possibly parasitic mites. So, birds have to keep their feathers clean. And the process is called preening. And they're literally running the feather through their beak, which can help them repair. Remember, I showed you last time feathers that had a feather that had a break in it, kind of on the side. They can repair that. And that's one of the things that preening does. Let's see. Does not want to, okay. Well, that first video doesn't seem to exist anymore. All right. Let's see if the second video, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. Nope, those videos don't exist anymore. Shoot. All right, but if you watch birds, you've probably seen them doing this. You might also see that they go take their beak to the base of their tail and then go around their feathers and then go back to the base of the tail and go back to their feathers. At the base of the tail, there is a gland, the uropygial gland. Oof. Sorry, guys. Nasty name. Sometimes called the preen gland. And it secretes an oil that the bird then spreads over its feathers that provides waterproofing. This is used for waterproofing the feathers. You know, wild birds, they're outside in the weather. They've got to be waterproof. Mary, go ahead.
Hi, can you repeat that again?
The uropygial gland secretes an oil that the birds apply to their feathers, which waterproofs the feathers. Everybody got that? All right, good. So birds got to keep their feathers in shape. Not only preen, they also, of course, bathe. Most birds will bathe in water, and they'll even do it in the winter time. Now, if we take a bath, we submerge our whole body in the water. Birds don't do that. They tend to just splash the water over their backs. So they don't always get soaking wet. Sometimes they will, especially birds that are in a captive situation. They might spend a lot of time in the bath and be, completely soaked. Wild birds don't do that as often because they always need to be able to fly. And if they're waterlogged, they'll weigh more and it's harder for them to fly. And birds will do this even in cold weather. In Massachusetts, I used to have a heated bird bath. And all winter, I would have birds come and take baths. Certain species that are naturally occurring in deserts will do dust baths instead. So here's an ostrich throwing dust up over their back. And this little English sparrow is also taking a dust bath. And then there's anting. This is a bizarre phenomenon. What is happening here? There are two things that could be happening here. One is that the bird is spreading its feathers open so that they get exposed to sunlight. The other is that they are anting. So you'll see vultures do this like in the mornings. They spread their wings out. They're getting sun on their body to warm up in the mornings. But if they're on the ground like this guy is, he's probably sitting in an area where there are lots of ants. And the ants are going to be crawling on his body. And those ants can help to remove parasites. So they're crawling on the bird and removing mites and ticks and anything else that might be on the bird's body. Okay, one last thing about wings, and that is clipping the wings. Clipping the wings is cutting the flight feathers. Let's see. And generally speaking, it's the primaries. It's not the secondary flight feathers, it's the primary flight feathers. The idea here is that it is reducing the likelihood that the bird will fly away. In this particular image, it's a chicken. I'm assuming it's kept outside and they don't want it to fly off. If it's a house bird, you may not want it to accidentally go out the door and fly away. Or you may like to take your bird outside and you don't want it to fly away. When we are talking about pet birds, clipping the wings is a controversial topic. Some people clip both wings. Some people say clip one wing. This is just cutting the dead feathers. It's not hurting the bird, but it does impact their ability to fly. Some individual birds are capable of flying even with clipped flight feathers. And their feathers will grow back. So you've always got to keep an eye on that. The people who clip one wing generally do that because it's harder for the bird to get lift, to move up off the ground, because they're out of balance. The downside to that is that if they get startled and jump off of something, they can't use their wings to land gently, and they're more likely to veer and fly into a wall or something and get injured. Many, many people think that birds should have the opportunity to fly in the house. So birds that are let loose in the house, you know, whether or not you clip them, it's like I said, different people have different opinions on it. If you take your bird outside, it should be in a crate or on a leash. I spent one horrible evening trying to help my friend catch her bird when I was really much younger. She had taken it outside. Its flight feathers were clipped and it got up into a tree. And it got up into the top of the tree. And once a bird gets up into a top of a tree, it's very hard to get them back. They should be trained to come when called, and we'll talk about that when we talk about training birds. But no bird is 100% reliable at coming when called. It might, but it might say, hey, I kind of like it up here. I don't want to go back inside. So it is something to think long and hard about. When we talk about small cage birds like canaries and finches, those birds should never have their flight feathers trimmed. So never clip wings on canaries and finches. I don't know if you can see that. Those birds need a cage that's big enough for them to fly at least a little bit. And they're not capable of, their legs are not very strong. Most pet birds have strong legs. So birds in the parrot family, the parakeets, cockatiels, parrots, cockatoos, macaws, are used to and capable of using their feet a lot. And they'll pick things up with their feet, manipulate them, climb the cage with their feet. Canaries and finches do not do that. They're a very, very different type of bird. All right. And I saw somebody did respond to the couple of questions in the chat. This is nothing like declawing a cat. Any other questions about feathers? Okay, then let's talk about beaks. We think about feathers and beaks when we think about birds. The shape of the bird's beak is related to what the bird eats. This is a cute little graphic. We're going to look at some better images, but I kind of like that you can tell this bird eats breakfast cereal by the beak. So we're going to go through some of the major categories of birds that are kept as pets, and we're going to talk about their beaks. So when we talk about parrots, you can see they have this long hook at the end. But the beak itself is kind of short and tall. So there's a lot of height to this beak, and it's, not that long. These are very strong beaks. And the taller the beak, the stronger. Parrots can crack open nuts. So you don't want to be bitten by one of these guys. They will put a hurting on you. That hook at the end is used to manipulate things. So if you've ever, if you've ever cut open a nut, the meat is on the inside and you have to figure out some way to get it out. It doesn't just pop out. That hook is how the parrots get the meat out. Faith, go ahead.
So so I've seen a very interesting example for not with nuts, but actually with fruit. So at my high school, I went to Essex Tech. So we kept a lot. So we had in the small animal building, there was a bird room where we had different birds. And so one of those birds was this gorgeous macaw, and my teacher would feed him grapes. And so what he would do with the grapes was he would use his beak to peel off the skin of the grapes and just eat the flesh.
That is awesome.
Yeah, he would peel the skin off the grapes and just eat the flesh. He was such a character.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the personality that you get out of parrots. Absolutely. Now, this is still a parrot. It's a budgie, but, oh, and does anybody want to tell me the sex? Remember how we tell the sex of budgies? Male. All right, good job. All right, so again, the beak is relatively tall, not very long, and it has a hook at the end. They are not as strong as the big parrots, but they are relatively strong for their size. And it's not pleasant to be bitten by a parakeet or budgie, but it's not like you're gonna have your finger broken, which is a possibility with some of the bigger parrots. Canaries and finches are seed eaters, and they have a conical shaped beak. So it looks like a cone stuck to their beak. It's kind of stubby. It does not have a hook, and it's used to crack seeds open. The outside layer of seeds is not nutritious, and birds don't eat it. So they actually take the outer layer off. These guys do not have a lot of bite force. And, you know, if you're handling a small songbird like this, the worst case scenario would be if it like bit the webbing right between your fingers, and, you know, pretty much anything right there hurts. Meat and fish eaters have a hooked beak, but their beak is long. So remember, the parrot beak is tall. This has a long hooked beak. And that hook is used to pull pieces of meat off of a prey item, or to pull pieces of meat off of a fish item, or to help hold a fish while they're flying back to land to eat it. So birds with this kind of beak do not do a lot of manipulation of things like parrots do. The beak is just, you know, it's pretty much pull and swallow, pull a piece off and swallow. And they're not as strong as a parrot beak. I'd rather be bitten by this guy than by a parrot. Although I really wouldn't want to be bitten by this guy. So here we can compare the two. See the height on this macaw's beak compared to the height on this guy, and the length on the macaw versus the length on this hawk. Very, very different beaks, even though they both have a hook. Okay, these guys look very similar to a seed eater bill, except they're straight and not as tall compared to what you see on a seed eater. Seed eater. Ooh, it's getting late in the week. So the beak is long and pointed. A lot of seed eaters will catch and eat insects, but these guys are specialized insect eaters. That is all these guys eat. And these guys, this is a whippoorwill. They catch insects on the wing. And so they are specially adapted to have this huge mouth opening, but their beak, you really can't see it in this image. There's a really tiny, tiny little beak here and here. And this part if his mouth was closed, you wouldn't think that he had a big mouth. You would think that he had a little tiny mouth. And you can also see the rictal bristles here. That's a sign of something that eats insects that it catches on the wing. There are hummingbirds and other nectar feeders that also have long, thin beaks. Their beaks are longer than insect eaters and often have, they're seriously long, and it's not uncommon for them to have a curve on their beak. So here is a hummingbird. You can see how very, very long that beak is. That is a nectar feeder beak. So he sticks his beak in a flower to drink the nectar. And then, of course, we have our flamingo, which has one of the weirdest beaks of the bird world. You can kind of see the edges here. Remember when we looked at Sassy's beak and we could see those little folds of tissue right at the edge of the beak? These folds are used to strain food out of the water. So the flamingos, they eat, their head is upside down when they eat. This part of the beak is sifting through the soil at the bottom of the water, stirring things up that might be sitting on the bottom of the water. And it takes in a mouthful of food, a mouthful of water, and then uses its tongue to push the water out those little ridges along the side of the beak. And anything like shrimps or small crustaceans will get trapped inside. And that's what the flamingos eat. Okay. Now, when we're talking about pet birds, the healthy beak should be pretty smooth. You can see on the surface of this parrot, it looks very, very smooth along the surface here. The left and the right side should be symmetrical. There should not be peeling or discoloration. A little bit of peeling is okay. You see a little bit of peeling here. That's okay. But a lot of it is a sign of problems. And you also have to worry about the length. This is not a healthy beak. You can see how incredibly long that is. It's way too long. There's weird edge to it. You can see that edge doesn't look right. There's some peeling here on the lower beak, some peeling here. In captivity, birds do not always have access to the kinds of food that they eat in the wild, and in the case of parrots, objects that they manipulate. So parrots in the wild mess with all kinds of stuff with their beak. And so in the wild, they can usually maintain their beak, keep it the right length just through use. In captivity, this can be a problem. We can also have, oh boy, I don't know how much room I have here. It can also be problems because of trauma. Maybe they flew and landed badly. Bad nutrition will cause the beak to overgrow. And certain diseases, especially diseases of the liver, will cause their beak to grow wrong. This is not a DIY job. This needs to be corrected by a vet. Once a bird has shown that their beak overgrows like this, they should probably have routine visits to the vet to make sure that the beak is staying nice and short. Just like dog and cat nails, the beak has a blood vessel in it. So if you've ever dealt with a long nailed dog, a dog whose nails have just really ridiculously grown, you know you have to trim them back a little bit today, a little bit in a couple of days, a little bit more in a couple of days. You can't just cut him straight. Same thing with this. How does this bird eat? I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea how this bird managed to feed itself. Unlike toenails, the shape of the beak is critical. So minor corrections can be done with a file or a Dremel tool, but you probably need to work with a vet, an avian vet, to help this. When I was doing wildlife rehabilitation, we had a, would you trim the beak like trimming nails? If you use a Dremel for trimming nails, it would be similar. But if you use like the guillotine or the cutting for trimming nails, then no, you don't want to just cut this. So we had a gull that was brought in to rehab that had a badly overgrown beak. And it was emaciated. It was, on the verge of starving, which is why somebody was able to catch it. And so the vet worked on that bird for a couple of months to get the beak back to a normal length. We released the bird. 2 years later, somebody caught the bird again. Its beak had overgrown again. There was some reason that the beak wasn't lined up correctly and had a tendency to overgrow. So again, we spent months getting the beak back into shape so the bird could be released again. Yes, I did wildlife rehab for about 5 years. I even had, for part of that time, it was my full-time job. So when we get to wildlife rehab towards the end of the semester, I'm speaking from experience.
That's awesome.
Any questions before we wrap up? Mary, go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to know if we're having a final exam, like an accumulative test in this class?
We're not having traditional type exams. So what we're having is a lot of small little quizzes. So we have a quiz every week, and several times in the semester, we're going to have what I'm calling a review quiz, which is longer than a quiz, shorter than an exam, and is cumulative. So the final review quiz will be cumulative, but it's still not going to be as many questions as an exam, and it's not going to be as big a part of your grade as you would expect an exam to be. All right, and if that's it, oh, Abigail, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. Did you happen to get my email about the project ideas?
Were you thinking Minabird?
Yes.
I did get it. I'm sorry. Have I not gotten back to you?
No, I haven't heard anything back.
Yeah, that should be fine. Minabirds are fine.
Okay.
All right. Then let's